this?
Are we supposed to be quiet?
Maybe. All right, I'll start by introducing myself. Hi, I'm Mark from Green Apple Books in San Francisco. Thanks for joining us tonight for our event. We have a list of events posted on our website where you can find them at greenapplebooks.com/events. And tomorrow night, on October 8th, we'll be introducing Neil Carlin's This Thing Called Life at 6 p.m. And the following day, October 9th, Shannon Lee and Jeff Chang will be joining us for a reading from their new book, Be Water, My Friend, at 7 p.m. And I hope everyone has a chance to tune in. Tonight, I'm happy to introduce Kazim Ali. Kazim Ali was born in the United Kingdom and has lived transnationally in the United States, Canada, India, France, and the Middle East. His books encompass multiple genres, including several volumes of poetry, novels, and translations. He is currently a professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego. His newest books are a volume of 3 long poems entitled Voice of Sheila Chandra and a memoir of his Canadian childhood, Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water. We also have Brian Teare with us tonight. His collections of poetry include The Room Where I Was Born, winner of the Brittingham Prize and the 2004 Tom Gunn Award for Gay Poetry, Sitemap, Pleasure, winner of the Lambda Literary Award, Companion Grasses, which was a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and was named one of Slate's best poetry books of 2013. And joining alongside other fantastic poets is Gillian Conoley, Gillian Connolly's A Little More Red Sun on the Human, new and selected poems with Nightboat Books won the 39th Annual Northern California Book Award in 2020. She received the 2017 Shelley Memorial Award for Lifetime Achievement from the Poetry Society of America, among other honors. She is the author of 7 previous books, including Peace, an Academy of American Poets standout book, and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Tonight's book is available for purchase in-store or on our website. It helps us out as a store and helps us continue to put on events like this. It supports the authors who put their heart into these books, and plus you get a new book out of it. And now for Kazim's latest book, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, right here. The reason we're here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Kazim, Gillian, and Brian. Take it away.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thanks for being here, everybody. It's so great. We didn't even talk about who was going to read first, or can I choose since it's my party? I would love to hear Brian first, and then Gillian, and then maybe I'll go. I feel like it.
Sounds great. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. I first just wanted to say I'm really honored to be reading in celebration of Kazim and of your new book, Kazim. I have been reading your work. It feels like for as long as I've been a poet, though I know that's not entirely true, but I feel like your poems have accompanied me into poetry life, and as I have grown as a poet, I feel like your poems have urged me forward. So I really appreciate being able to celebrate you. It's awesome to read with Gillian, my soul sister. So I am gonna read a short excerpt from a poem in progress. And it's very much in progress, but given the kinds of formal risks that Kazim's work takes and how it pushes us forward into a visionary realm, I just am going to risk this. Our days came from the animal, the anonymous animal, one of us touched in the market, and did not know then a hunger great as a god entered us hunting, as it had hunted the collateral animal extracted from vanishing habitat and trafficked as trade, brought to shiver and shit in a cage before barter or slaughter. Dear animal, we did not know. The weeks would pass like wings, fanned open in pursuit of food, and blindly we'd fasten our faces to the wind wired with sirens and listen for news of the next. From the traveling lover's kiss, from the racist passerby's spit, from the Biogen conference, from the unemployment office, from the billionaire's blather, from the coworker's cough, from the handsome dancer, from the neighbor's mom, quietly the informant arrived, hungry at the viral threshold. Little messenger wearing a crown, with a way of saying hello, so swiftly intimate it hit us, where we had no resistance, and began to breathe our breaths. In line outside our local poll of broken voting machines, in line inside the testing site, whether we knew it or not, our lungs, a sudden network of caves, and we, the people, one vast hibernacula of bats, the small animals of our days, roosting inside us, fevers, fast as the teleprompters, feeding the politicians' myths and facts. We saw how our bodies changed and how the stories we were told and then told each other changed almost daily into new forms. Form is our first plurality, matter, atomic and bonded, promiscuous energy, each of us a body bounded by attractors and attachments, our mortal material porous, sublime and prone to violence, and pleasure at uncertain edges, wet and lined with bright mucosa. The informant enters so easily, spirare, the spiraling of air as we breathe in or on or with, out of our plural pronoun now. Here at the Ravenna's red mud edge, I step into the factual. Water heavy with sediment. The river's surface looks slow, but the current beneath it surges urgent as the world, swollen with sexual spring, and fronts that cross the Blue Ridge to paint the foothills with rain. The catalpa drops white flowers on the storm-stained waters, and I open the bent notebook, my mind steadied against event, its perpetual rhyme with time, and write the way the river insists into itself without a name for where its waters are heading. The floodplain full of grasses lapses just now into shadow, hissing a bit in the wind. Now's the hour of encounter, hour of swallow before owl, one kind of wing feeding in loops over the rapids, one kind of wing biding time, high in the riparian canopy, one clock for prey species, one clock for predators, time that sends our lives into our second plurality, the numberless other after matter, the breathless beyond persons. This is my book of changes. On it, the river birch speaks, its underbark a secret skin, aroused into meaning. For wasn't I once a lover also, his cock blunt as the rough cough of a robin stalking the field, eager with its dirty beak. His whole body a habitat I grew in, longing for water, my long limbs locked with light. And didn't I shed fleshy paper in fragmentary increments? Didn't I resist diminishment as the ground around me vanished? Thank you. That's all I'd like to read.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful, Brian. Thank you.
That was really beautiful. I'm gonna read, I'll read 2 poems. I'll read one from a little more Red Sun on the Human, the new and selected. And then since Brian's been so brave, I'm going to read a new poem that I wasn't expecting to read. And that is absolutely in the spirit of Kazim. I was just talking with my class about the incredible forays into sound and music that this new book makes and the risks it takes. And it just seems so appropriate to do that, to read what's just right fresh off the page. So I'm going to do that too. But first I'll read every epoch. Every epoch dreams it has been destroyed by catastrophe. A mass ego only properly exists in earthquakes and catastrophes. A mass ego as in music, the one song everyone loves. But the violence one has to incorporate is great. The joy is mighty. The one song everyone loves, loved. Every epoch dreams time is a water garden in a weedy churchyard. No hell in your draft. There are other terrors. I sleep, you sleep, he, she, it sleeps, you sleep, they sleep, we sleep. The incomparable moon chapter over mine enemy. Strong leader dozes off in horizon's dank corridor, calm nights along sensorium's riverbank. Objects freed of their utility, completely unmoored. An epic dreams, and one follows any adversary on land, any adversary in the bottom of the brain, an enemy sitting across from a lover, calmly editing a lover, her salad, a mirage. A real world could come back to us as an epic, similar to a short while and a further example. Ecstatic child leaning over a pickle barrel, a time bruise on the pickle barrel. A few masterpieces droop, and epic dreams in the ruinous thereof. Every epic dreams, and one follows. Every epic dreams, one follows as a figment in one setting beyond this earth, even. And this is, this poem, I just titled it, it's The Blue Hand, is the title of the poem. Vallejo had a line, the blue unedited hand of God, I think. And so, the blue hand. Paradise was burning again in reflexivity, marine layer moist, still under smoke, a seafoam fiber optics. Breeze isn't. It was before or after our deaths. The workplace hipster turned despot was berating you digitally since he'd never have to see you again because COVID, because you were getting so old, spittle formed a stalagmite on your lips. Both faces and their utterances were compiled, exchanged, mistaken for one another in an inner biomass stew. What got served in prison? On the third day of clear air, a ruby-throated hummingbird as the neighborhood defamiliarizes and clouds return to break into hawk, shadow. Venmo, wants the instructor, as the money goes into immaterial sky. You can send money to your friends, she says, just before you wave to your friends. If you want to talk, hold up the blue hand. It was the new era. Time messed up. Took 4 times its space. It was why nothing felt finished or even wanted to. The door was too hot to the touch. That's how you know there was a fire. Eurydice kept turning back to the no one there in every room. The paint colors beckoned to be reborn. The taupe come night, the gray chalk, the Puritan opacity, the silver-wigged patriarchy, the Puritan opacity, the skimmed off white. A story breaks, virally, fungally. On the fifth day, the grasshopper came in the house, lay placid, the dragonfly too, with its heavily lidded eyes of extraordinary peripheral vision. We began to climb into, what is the word? Radiation off the phone, a manic glory. As you searched, we began to climb into the data bank, dinner, amphetamines, jade, turquoise, equipoise, convexities laced with porosity, air, a go bag, 6 days, 7. Do we rest? We wanted to know, are there creeks or pools, at least partially in back of us? Are we offshore wind inexpressibles? Are our migrations lower than spheres? Are we form or are we formless? Is this our deaths or our infant pure dust in our eyes? Thank you very much. Now we have Kazim.
Thank you so much, Gillian. It's amazing to hear, and Brian, it's just amazing to hear your work. I'm really happy to be doing this. This is my first actual live event for this book. The actual pub date was yesterday. So this is kind of like, I'm calling it the Left Coast launch. Alice James is doing an official book launch on Friday. But it's happening at a bookstore in Brooklyn virtually, like everything else. So this feels like my home launch. And even though Green Apple on the Park wasn't there when I lived in San Francisco, it was a block away from where I lived. So I feel like if it had been there, I would have hung out there a lot. And since that time, I've spent a lot of time in that place. So even though we're in virtual space, I still feel like I'm glad to be with you both. And Brian, your work also has meant so much to me, over the years, and Gillian, of course. One of my turning points in poetry, I guess maybe we all have that, where you read a certain book or you read a certain poem and you're like, what, and it changes you as a poet. And for me, that was, as a wee lad, when I read, not really, it wasn't that wee, but when I read Lovers in the Used World, actually there were 3 poems from Lovers in the Used World that were in the art. Gillian, you were featured in Poets and Writers, and they had 3 poems from Lovers in the Used World in the Poets and Writers. And I read those poems and I was just like, who is this person, So to be friends all those years later, to know you and to know your work, and to now, be all part of the Nightboat family together, is really special to me. So thanks for coming, everybody. I'm so excited to read to you from this book. And it's really nice to see so many familiar names who are here. So I hope you'll throw up some Q's, and we'll try to give you some A's. We're gonna have a little bit of time for that after I finish reading. So please do. It's 3 long poems, and although they're interleaved with these little fragments. So I want to open with the fragment that opens the book. And it's called Recite. Small animal, recite. You sent nowhere, arriving in the night, all my forgotten prayers. Not prayers, really, nothing to ask for, no one would answer. The crassness of calling, a body, a corpse, the lawnmower sound, and the housekeeper singing. Is this body a house? Is this house a body? God's like you, a misfit. You don't fit, he don't fit. The central poem of the book is called The Voice of Sheila Chandra. And it's actually, it's either one poem made up of 40 sonnet-length stanzas, or it's a sequence of 40 sonnets. It's probably both of those things at once. There are ways in which it's a cycle that builds, and there are ways in which each individual stanza, sonnet stanza, stands on its own. So I kind of thought that normally when I read from it, I just choose different sonnets and read. Normally, this is the second time I've read from this book. The last time I read from the book, I just chose different sonnets and read them. But tonight I want to actually read the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in a row, because I just want you to get a sense of the opening of the trajectory of the book. And also because the 6th sonnet has Agnes Martin in it, who I know is, Brian has written muchly about her, including in his, not the most recent book, but the one before that. So these are the first 6 sonnets / sonnet stanzas. Breaks is constant, was like the river, light on the river, riven that remained a rift, an old rill that sounded. She merged with the vibe, ration of the drum, a hum, a home, womb, and she moaned in the loam, dark earth, come, Sheila, dame, ocean, dome this poem, roam to tome, tomb, foam, original fountain that fed my mom, Zamzam, when I was born. Who can in syllables like Sheila Chandra moan, us covered in a blanket of sound, this like cloud bank of stars keeping us from eternity, which under the blanket seen, like Sanjay, a dancer who I somehow look like, was mistook for 3 times in one day 20 years ago, but the story still resounds. Some woman at a festival saw him perform, swore I was he. I said I wasn't. She did not believe. Me, brass, bowl, soul, swindle, through years, no identity, theft. I want to move like that, off the axis of the spine, into where and where. Sanjay said, I am not him. And what does all this have to do with the voice of Sheila Chandra? She, having lost, having now no longer sound, now a constant striking into chaos, that note that flickers through in abstraction. One is 1 or 0 and confused. The ear does not focus, neither opens nor closes, always is. Long before she lost it, drifts unanchored, wanted to merge, and the body of the singer become the body of the instrument. Talk to the drum, find it, hum, study its vowels. She made her vow to sound slowly, syllable by syllable. She pronounced words in Uzbek, word unmoored, word pure sound. Oh, river, long had I been, long seasons invaded by your current, devoured your tongue of water. Those years, time bent, my one voice spoke. Carried cacophony, world wheel into the human, one small voice, box, pool, swum, midnight we went into the sea, expecting our prayers might carry themselves across the silver slammed surface. Would be answered, or do they answer? Pale cut of prayers do not answer. Like back into the dark water, what are those stripes of light across the room? A shape that evaporates upon waking, what language cannot hold on to, what you cannot hold on to. Closer, the wire against my shins warns me from falling blue into the painting is always a web, each cell holding a prisoner of thought. Where is God? Where is what goes through the cute, short, thick, bearded guy's mind with the tape measure and the keys on his belt I've been following, holds the bathroom door open 1 second too long, and I nearly followed him inside, but body language is hard to read. I stayed with the painting, and now he too is staring into the islands and writing Agnes Motherfucker Martin into his notebook. So the last stanza takes place in the Guggenheim Museum at the Agnes Martin, fabulous Agnes Martin exhibit that they did a couple of years ago, 2016, maybe, yeah. So anyways, that's a little bit of the drama that happens. Sheila Chandra, the singer, lost her voice to burning mouth syndrome, a neurological condition that has neither cause nor cure, and renders the mechanisms of the voice in the mouth almost functionally unusable. There's nothing wrong with them, quote unquote, but it causes intense neurological pain when someone speaks or, you know, uses or laughs or anything like that. So Sheila Chandra became, after a long singing career, functionally mute, actually. So I thought that I would read in the second, well, palette cleanser, let me read another one of the short fragments. This one is called No Name. It's like both kinds of no name. No name, why this holy day honed, hollow day hall, I lost wind when wooden, I can't bear to be unaided in hunt, unhanded, to haunt when strewn sound, who will be held in hand, brought, sent, mooring at the shore, who are you for what fewer who wore, be called this war, more who are the ones in horror to light, will strew, then sue for war. The opening poem in the book is another long poem. It's called Hesperine for David Berger. And the form is, it's somewhat like the form of my book, Bright Felon, in that it's long single lines. Although unlike Bright Felon, Bright Felon, a book which is named after a line from one of Gillian's poems, if you don't know. So the phrase Bright Felon is Gillian's phrase. So my book, Bright Felon, is very much in prose and uses the rhythm. The lines are in the rhythms of prose, whereas the Hesperine for David Berger, these are meant to be verse lines. And so on the one hand, there is no punctuation in these lines, and you'll see I kind of indented the beginning of each to kind of show that this is intended to be a verse line. So this poem unfolds over the length of the poem, and it has its own architecture. And so to read just a portion of it is maybe challenging. I'm just going to read you kind of like the entry point to it. So I just want to say two things about it. The first is that the Hesperine is a term, it's an invented term. It's meant to be a poem that curses the falling of light. There are poems that curse the coming of dawn, the Obad, which is an ironic curse because it's like a love poem, but it curses the dawn. And there are poems that are evocations to the night, the Serenade, the classic Serenade, you know, as a love poem. But I thought instead the curse against history, because sometimes history deserves to be cursed. It's so horrible. And that's what I was dealing with here. And so it was Olga Brumas who suggested the term Hesperine for a poem that is a poem of the evening. Hesperus being the Greek evening star, and Phosphorus, the bringer of light. When it was translated into Latin, it became Lucifer. Phosphorus was the morning star. The Greeks didn't know that it was the same heavenly body, that they were both Venus. They only learned that when they began commerce and intellectual exchange with the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians knew all along that it was two They were two separate bodies. So this is it's a curse in a fashion. And David Berger himself appears in the poem, but if I don't get to him in the excerpt I'm reading you, you will have to look up and find out who he is. Begin with the dining room attendant at the ivy-covered university who smashed the stained glass window, because now we are actually going to change history. Imagine then, in the suburbs of Cleveland, a sculpture of steel rings broken in halves, but opening up away from the bullet-ridden history of the burning helicopter toward open sky. Seems possible because there is a bridge between general relativity and quantum mechanics that no physicist has yet ascertained. Imagine neither a conditional future if the past were different, nor forging ahead from the broken, but something newer that bridged that loss. For example, what if a painter left the canvas entirely and instead looked at all the extant surfaces in the already man-made and man-frayed world? History, then, as fragile as stained glass, and yet writing new narratives that shape every movement forward. Both ways of understanding the behavior of matter cannot be true, yet somehow they still behave as true on the lived-in planet. David Berger, at 27, deciding to move across the world to Israel to train and compete in the Olympics. 1972, Munich. What Corey Menifee did is he climbed up on top of a table in the dining room, and with the long handle of his broom, he sank in bits and pieces to God the road you knew, which was the confusion road, the one made of all your wrong turns. Geometry of a building makes it stand. Math is mighty. There are abstractions in every letter. Their architecture makes sound possible. For each of you, a practice, it says in the Quran. If God had willed, he would have just made you one people. Imran Qureshi does not paint on canvases, but paints little blossoms on the ground, on the wall, in corners of the room. They bloom like water or blood or light. While the Khawali singer Amjad Sabri groans his throat open in ecstatic sound, aiming to reach from the muck of earth all the way into heaven. From the summit, I plummet then into the time of the unstrung lyres to try to go back to the dark time. A letter arriving in the night mysterious reads, a reminder, we do not forget, we do not forgive. Translator of frozen scripts, you try to tongue your way through that old score, that shame. I am still trying to settle. Sky, boat, bear me down along these reticent chords while I plumb lupin fields in search of lingering snow. Do you know what your body is? Do you know what God is? Music that do sound off strings into voice from the body's drum that sings, breath through is wind, shattered the panes of the stained glass window depicting enslaved workers bearing cotton along a road. Hesperus, the evening star, shines with a cold light through the tightest drawn evenings, sharp-edged and dissolute. He came into work in the dining room every day, and he hated that one image in the glass. And one day and all of that was wrong, was a pattern painted not last year or 100 years ago, but I mean yesterday or this morning. Sun is going down in the wrong horizon. The sea glows green, then blue, then green again. This is where I was born, this in-between place. And so I curse the fucking dawn that grinds men to powder, tears them from their bodies, flings them down the hot barrel of a gun. How then to catalog the metadata of all the corpses that locate for us our own bodies and register this Western comfort, bullet punching through a body, like punching through a ticket, registering it for taxes. Do you know what God is, what's not? Do you know what art is, what's not? Do you know what a nation is, a citizen, a crime? Sir, this world has always asked me for my labor, then been silent upon delivery. Star of evening, twin brother was phosphorus, star of morning, who rose up in the dawn and brought new day, metaphor, of course, for new life. Well, that's about the first quarter of the poem, and it goes on. Thank you for listening. I'm going to close with one small fragment, another one of the small fragments, just as a way of leaving the leaving the range and rage of David Berger. This is another small fragment from later in the book. It's called Wrong Star. Remember, I told you the Greeks thought they were different, two different stars. They were really the same star, and they weren't even a star, they were a planet. But Venus, right? So this is Wrong Star. Wrong star I chose to sail under alone. I did not want to be alone, brought or abandoned those nights when I did not know. Who could know? Am I invited? Do you remember? Which question needs answer? Thank you for listening, everybody. I'm going to go over to the chat here and see if we have any, and people pop up any comments or questions that you have. Sarah Katana Epps says, yay, you're the best, Professor Ali. Then she says, woo. What is your process for creating these euphonics? I have tried listed words that have assonance or consonants, but still have nothing near as beautiful as your verses. Is it a natural talent? Do you, either of you want to talk about your work, or should I just talk about I don't know what does euphonics mean? Like, what does euphonics mean? Beautiful sounds. Marco just told me.
Euphony, yeah.
Yeah. Listen, I grew up listening to a lot of poetry in Urdu and Arabic and Farsi, which at the time were all languages I didn't understand. I still don't really understand them, but so it was weird. Like, the first poetry that I experienced was poetry I didn't know what it meant. All I really heard was the sound. And a lot of that poetry is sung, not recited. And so I feel like there was a lot of emotion in the recitation. And so before I loved anything about poetry, I loved emotion and I loved sound. So I do, like, a lot of times the associations start in my notebook and I just kind of write down words that sound like each other. And then a poem kind of builds out of it in a way. But I love working with sound. It's my favorite thing. And so there are times when people talk about poetry that's supposedly difficult because of the meaning is like more opaque. But I listen to it and I just love listening to it like as music almost. Susan Howe is one of the poets that I really love to recite out loud and just listen to. And then someone is like, inevitably is like, what do you think it means? And I'm like, well, I'm not really sure. I don't really know if that's what's important to me about it. I'm being flip, of course. There's deep meaning in her work, and I do enjoy it, and I've talked about it. But I guess that's where I'd start with is, I think it was Richard Hugo who said there are poets who believe that truth must conform to music, and poets who believe that music must conform to truth. And I think it's a meaning like one is either more important to you than the other. And I think for me, I fall on the side of music being the most important. In fact, and I don't think it was always true for me as a poet. You know, in my earliest book, I think, in The Far Mosque, which was my first book, I think I was like the gutsiest that I'd ever been. And then ever since that point, I felt like I drifted more and more towards trying to write poems that people would understand. other people might not agree, but that was my intention. And then I think with this book, I went really firmly back into, I mean, I invoke Amjad Sabri, who's a Qawwali singer, and there's something about Qawwali, which is really about, and Sufi practice in general, which is really about like getting out of your head. And that's why there's all these metaphors in Rumi for like, I mean, they use madness as a metaphor. We wouldn't do that now, but there's something about leaving behind normal logic and kind of trying to enter into a space where you are untethered from all of that. So I think that's what I'm going to say about that. Layla, thank you, Layla, for being here. I'm so glad. You say, I want to ask you about the risk both Brian and Gillian mentioned tonight, which seems so often in your work to be a risk of sound or cadence, and which always, for me, creates so much space and feels so invitational and generous. I'm struggling a bit in my own practice to take those associated risks, ones that can deprivilege a piece's narrative in favor of what, without readers feeling shut out of the work or feeling that it obscures what I'm trying to share. Is there a tension for you between that risk and the welcome and spaciousness of your work? How in your practice do you balance these things? Is there a relationship for you between risk and vulnerability? I think it's a question that all three of us could address, and I actually want to hear from you guys about that very question. What do you think about that? Because I think that's something that applies to all three of us in terms of, I don't know if you two would precisely say deprivileging the narrative, but there is tension between narrative and the associative risk, and there's also the question of like obscuring, like would you call it obscuring or would you call it something else? But I'm curious to just know in general, what do you think?
Gillian, why don't you go first?
I have a line from from the first long poem, the Hesperine for David Berger, that is from you, Kazim. Do you even know it all, or do you just have to sing to find the place of voice breaks? And I love that line, and it seems that this whole thing of, and especially, you know, given that the title, I'm talking about your work, but I'll get to mine. The voice of Sheila Chandra, that, you know, that it's a voice it's not capable of voicing, and that it seems as though you're working with that we're in a place of history that how does one voice this particular moment in time? How does one voice history? How can one do that? How could anyone possibly take that kind of authority today and do that? And that also ties in with narrative, and, you know, that there is some kind of overriding narrative that could conceivably speak to the moment, which seems equally impossible. And yet narrative, for me anyway, wouldn't be something that I would throw out completely ever. It just seems sort of embedded in, I think it's embedded in human consciousness all over the world, actually. But the notion that there is a singular narrative, that there's an authoritative narrative, you know, would be something I would completely reject. But not the idea that story doesn't still enchant, that story doesn't still have possibilities of being part of song, being part of nothing, you know, which I've started to trust in a lot more than something. Does that make sense?
I think I've recently, I mean, I think I too sort of have an answer drawn from Kazim's work that isn't necessarily about my work, but taught me something about both narrative and vulnerability, and that is from Bright Felon, which is a book, one could say it's a book of coming out, but it's also a book of coming out that lacks that sort of seminal scene in American queer literature of the actual coming out. And there, the suppression or omission, or just the fact that that scene is not there, but is felt throughout the entire book, the pressure of what it means both to have been silenced, to have silenced oneself, and then to not be able to tell a part of the story for various reasons, for very good various reasons that are kind of hinted at. And I felt that in that book, the fact that that story isn't there actually suits the story better. If it had been there, it would have been a very different kind of cultural narrative. It would have been a very different kind of emotional narrative. And so I think there are times when not telling the story, but showing sort of the shape of the whole at the center of the story, or the inability to tell certain parts of the story is more true than just barreling through and trying to render everything sort of representationally or mimetically. And then the way that that book is not unlike Carol Meso's work, sort of asynchronous and sort of constantly weaving back and forth through time. I learned a lot from that risk sometimes is in not saying, or in saying the story differently than sort of traditional linear logic, and that many stories demand a different way of telling in order to be accurately told. I think for myself, the story that I keep trying to tell, at least in recent years, is the one of our deep interconnectedness, and the fact that our interconnectedness is our greatest strength and the greatest poison, and which you can kind of see in the work that I read tonight. I think the pandemic is a beautiful example of like the risk of our interconnectedness, and then also the ways in which we come together despite the ways in which we're connected, and the risks that we pose to each other. And so I think the way in which matter, our material lives as creaturely beings, but also as you know, citizens of capitalism and as citizens of democracy, and citizens of an ecosystem, or many ecosystems, you know, I don't know how to tell that story, because it's the biosphere, it's life, it is being. And so like, really, if I wanted to tell that story, I would just be like, being. We're done. See ya. So to me, I think I keep trying to remind myself that those connections are not only terror, and those connections are not only risk, and those connections are not only the ways in which others use us and destroy us, but that those connections are also the places of our deepest loves and our deepest vulnerabilities and our deepest pleasures, and also our greatest power and strength. But I am always trying to find the poem that can hold even a fraction of like those interconnections and the power and the vulnerability of them. So I think every poem is an occasion to rethink how you tell it, for me, I think. But I love that about both Kazim and Gillian. Like, I feel like every poem for you guys is like a new way to discover how to tell part of the untold or the untellable.
I think that I'm very wedded to the beauty, actually, of the fragment, the evocativeness, the evocative nature of the fragment. So in a way, it's convenient that I have like a theoretical commitment as well to the notion that the story can't be finished, or in the case of Bright Felon, that there are certain like concealments that might happen, or restraint in expression, or all the different reasons why one is silenced. That book was about all the different, that book started as, I wanted to know why you know, how could I be silenced? Why was I so silenced? I wanted to know the answer. So that book was like kind of an expose in a fashion of myself. And I think besides the fragment, conversely, or maybe counterintuitively, there's an attraction to the long form or the serial form, because then that allows you to revisit and sound out and continue the gesture, basically. You know, so you have like a 20-page long poem or a 14-page long poem where you're really like, and yet it's made up of all these small parts. I brought up Susan Howe earlier, and someone in the question actually, and then we're going to get to John Fry's question too. So Anthony Sutton asked about this talk that I gave on Susan Howe's sequence Silence Wager Stories, which is in her book, Nonconformist Memorial. I am certainly in large ways indebted to the, like, you know, ferocity of her, Susan Howe's aesthetic commitment to the fragment, to found text, to collaging, and some kind of bravery of refusal to mean in any tidy way. Because I feel like as a queer person, as a Muslim, as an immigrant, as like a gender fluid person, in so many different ways, and none of those are fixed points. Also, may I say, because, you know, I'm an immigrant because I happen to be geographically in North America. When I go back to India, I'm not an immigrant, you know, or I have this kind of gender expression today, but next week I might change my mind. So I need space to, you know, live, basically. And so in lots of ways, I needed a poetic form that also, that there is no, you know, level of fixity there. And because I'm a real living person in the family, I left it. The coming out scene happens in Bright Fellow, and it just happens in a single sentence that says, I said what I had to say, or something like that. And so it functions in the work of art, it functions in a certain way. But the real actual reason is when I was writing that book, and then later, even when I published it, I was still in the middle of it with my folks and with my family, and I just couldn't include that. I couldn't include what happened. I couldn't include the conversation that we had. For actual life reasons that were beyond the notion of the art. And then it created while I was revising the book and someone was looking at it for me, Joshua Marie Wilkinson was looking at it for me, poet, no relationship to Marco Wilkinson, who's my partner, just someone with the same last name. And he said, it was him who pointed out, you know, you only use the word gay twice in this book, in the whole book. You only actually use that word, gay. And I was like, oh, I think I should just take it out. Should take out all mention of that word, you know, and let the book just quiver with the queerness of it. So I don't think the word queer is in there. I could be mistaken about that, but the word gay is not in there in the book. And so I think that kind of attention to, like, what you talk about at the tension, Layla, what you talk about, the tension between risk and vulnerability. In some sense, I think I just couldn't live if I wasn't bold enough to speak. So I left silence behind me with that book. And soon after that book, I decided to stop writing about God. I felt like I'd said enough, and I felt like to talk more about it would start to compromise what my own, you know, I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't engage spiritually anymore because I was exploring it in my writing, and I needed it to be personal again. And so I pulled back from all of that. As you can see, God will not be silenced. He's made a comeback, but that was not my doing. I want to make sure we get to John's question because I know we only have a little bit of time left, but John Fry says, hi there, Kazim and Brian and my fellow Texan Gillian. I hope this won't be a dull question, but since the word form showed up in what Brian and Gillian read, And since the poems I've heard and read range in ways that feel different, Kazim, I was wondering how form, in the sense of shape, body, lineation, and silence, is made manifest in the process of writing the poems all of you read tonight. So it is a question for all of us. I don't mean form as opposed to content, because I think they're indivisible in each of your poetics. And I ask in part because I'm working on new poems and I'm keenly aware of the dangers of repeating the shapes and sounds I already know how to make. I think that's a good fear to have. So I guess my question for all of you is, how do you write your way towards sounds/shapes you don't know how to make until they've been written? That's a really good question. Who wants to take a stab at this?
I love that the place you arrive, John, at the end, because I do think that I feel like I only have started kind of a new book and a new way of thinking. And those of you who know my work know that each of my books is pretty different. And they move really differently on the page and in language, so they share a kind of oral quality that I think is like a sort of signature of my own embodiment. That said, I think I only know I've started a new book when I actually don't sort of recognize the work. When I'm sort of like, is this even like a poem? Is this something I can save? And many of my books have started with poems that I just sort of put in a drawer and was like, yeah, that didn't work. That really sucks. And then coming back to it in 2 months or 3 months or 6 months, and then looking at it and being like, oh no, this actually is a poem. It's just not the way I was writing before, and it has a different prosody, or it has a different way of being on the page. And I will say some of that is just about patience and time and allowing yourself to basically, like Douglas Cuny says something about like it's important to shit yourself. And I sort of feel like that, you just have to be willing to make a mess. And those of us who are like lyric poets who like beauty in the way that all three of us are like total whores for the pretty. And so I think when you're a total whore for the pretty, it's really hard to shit yourself. But I think to me, it's important that I allow myself to do something really awkward and drafts that don't work, or contain things that are really that do work but are surrounded by a lot of crap, and really allow myself a time when I'm not on stage, sort of thinking of writing for publication, or thinking that I'm writing toward a book, or thinking anything other than just like, how do I, in the instance I'm thinking about, like, how do I write this? How do I write the interconnectedness of the pandemic, the way we're so deeply connected, and that connection is our deepest risk at this point. And how to like make that in all of its terror and all of its amazing beauty. And I still don't know, I'm still working on it. But yeah, so I don't know what anyone else would say, but I do feel like it's just, let yourself mess up until you make a new kind of beauty.
Yeah, I love the process so much that I resist the moment of realizing that I have a book. And I like to keep the poems as open as possible until they just sort of inch toward becoming something that feels, finished to me. I didn't always write like that. I've been writing a long time. My early work was, the tyranny of the left-hand margin. line breaks were made a certain way. They were heavily voiced. There was a particular kind of way of making a poem. And at a certain point in my trajectory, I rejected that completely and really wanted to open myself up to the possibility of anything entering the poem. And so I very much trust in the process. And I have a distrust. I have a distrust for symmetry. When I see it, I'm not a big fan of large senses of closure. I distrust authority. I do distrust high degrees of beauty, actually. So all of those things are just kind of what I'm working on right now. I don't want to ever be stuck in a particular modality of writing. I want to always be moving forward. And that means having a lot of patience. And as a person, I'm not exactly the most patient person in the world. So it's something that I've sort of trained myself in my work to do. And it has, for me, it has something to do with falling into the trance of making and really liking being there and enjoying that kind of, the process of actual writing and not thinking about publishing or product or things like that, really until the last kind of moment. And there is a point at which the poems come, there's enough of them and I kind of understand what I'm doing, and that where it does form into a book, and that's pleasurable too. And that becomes, a different thing. There's also a kind of sadness for me when that happens too, because it's like, oh, and then it'll just start. But I think, well, I can write another book, so I'll get to go back to that really kind of delicious place of unknowing and experiment and not knowing where you're going, but just trusting in the materials. Took me a long time to learn that, but I enjoy it now.
It looks like Kazim dropped off.
Never Kazim.
I don't know. Just in time. He wiggled his way out of having to answer. He was like, I can't do that one.
Maybe did it all. It's still recording.
Yeah. Sorry, John. Hopefully he'll come back. And
is John there?
Mark looks like he's turned off his.
Hi. Yeah.
Hi. There you go.
I'm back. Yeah. I don't know what happened there. But yeah, I mean, that was actually a fantastic last question.
Kazim, he may have lost his connectivity.
Well, I don't know if you guys want to continue. If there's, I think that was the last question, or we can wait and see if Kazim will.
Yeah, that was.
There we go.
Oh, there we go.
I'm so sorry, my computer battery just... I missed the end of what you said, Gillian. You were talking about the sadness of leaving a book.
Yeah, but then knowing that there'll be another one, I can go back into that state of unknowing.
And Kazim, do you want to answer and give John some stuff to think about?
John, as you know, Fanny Howe's the Howe sisters loom large in my life. Fanny Howe's Poetics of Bewilderment, I guess you would call it, from her essay Bewilderment, which is in which book, Brian? Gone? Is it in Gone? Anyhow.
It's in The Wedding Dress.
It's in The Wedding Dress. Bewilderment. I mean, that's a critical for me. You know, I feel like the poetics of confusion, derangement. Somebody else asked about puns and the slippages of meaning that happened in my work. That is the idea. Like, language to me, I guess, more than anything is material. I feel like I approach language the way a dancer approaches a, choreography or a gesture, or the way a painter works with paint. It is material to me. And I didn't really relate it to multilingualism or translingualism until much later in my life. But I'm a person who grew up listening to all of these languages in my house. And then we went to India when I was a very young child, and I grew up in a multilingual household where 3, 4, 5 languages were spoken, and then came to Canada and learned English and lost all of those other languages. But I do feel haunted by them. And I think language in general is very tricky, and sounds mean something and tones mean something. There's a Japanese scientist, I forget his name, he did research on like shouting at water. This is a real thing. It's what? It's Marco's saying it's bogus science. But, I saw those, I saw those results. I saw those crystals. And, I think that the way that we respond in our bodies when someone's shouting near us, the sense of like whatever, and then the liquid inside the body and how it reacts. Like, I think that sound has, and my yoga practice too has taught me this, that sound has an emotional quality, and that sound moves up and down the column of the spine. And the ancient yogis described that double helix and the chakras, the 7 chakras, they run up and down the spine. They had all these ideas about that. And to me, that makes, a lot of sense. And so there's a lot of mysticism in my book too, this one particular, like the science of nada yoga and the power of planetary bodies and the power of the moon and the tides and all of those things. Like, I think there's a lot of things we don't understand, but I think anything that affects water, for example, the full moon, if it can pull the ocean up, it can definitely pull the blood up in your body. You are made of so much water. So I think there's a lot of things that we don't understand. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to just return, because I hear in John, your question, a kind of anxiety around repeating oneself. And one thing that I think about actually all 3 of our works is that because all of us in some ways are metaphysicians, I think like a metaphysical poetics, I often think of someone like Dickinson, for instance, whose poems kind of outwardly look similar, with their dashes and their quatrains and their sort of hymn meter. And I think about the metaphysical stance as like a meditative stance. So like sitting on the cushion and sort of, and so to me, what I think is important about our work is that it's okay if outwardly the stance of, let's say, prayer or metaphysical attention looks the same, because the inward journey is different every time. And the inward logic of the poem will be different every time, even if there's a sort of posture or pose that we take. And I think that's true, like of many poets I really love, that's true of them. Like I love Carl Phillips' poems. Carl Phillips' poems like do a Carl Phillips pose. Like you could do a yoga pose out of his syntax. Like he's got a, and so I do feel like that actually is kind of a sign of a particular kind of metaphysical lyric practice, is sort of returning to the pillow or the cushion and assuming that shape, whatever that shape is for the individual poet. And it's different between Fanny Howe and Susan Howe, for instance, and who are both totally metaphysical poets. And it's different between Brenda Hillman and Gillian, and it's different between Kazim and I, because we all come from different traditions. We have different bodies, different languages, etc. But I think the ways in which our the signatures in our work that do repeat, I think has to do with returning to a certain posture toward language, toward the known and the unknown, toward the world. And that those repetitions, I think, are okay. I think I know that I too have had that anxiety. And as I said, like, my books all look really different, and I'm sure it's in part because of that anxiety, but I know that each of them also carries that sort of core or signature posture that's really similar. And I'm totally okay with that, because, you know, I look at Agnes Martin and I'm like, am I bummed that she made 1 million grids? No, I'm not. I'm really not. Do I like them all? No, I don't. Some of them are terrible, but that's fine.
Yeah. You can't get away from your neurology and your you know, your patterns of thought and your body and the way you hear sounds and the way you formulate ideas and language and all of that. At the same time, you can push against them.
Yeah, for me, it's always a new, every time, every encounter with the page, every foray into thought in language, it's always new. And that point of discovery of like what the form is, that's the critical point of the first transformation, of course, because then the form will then govern you or lead you in certain directions. You know, so I think one of the things that excites me the most about this new book of mine is that I allowed myself to explore the long lines in the first one, and then the short stanzaic ones in the second one. And the third one, I didn't read from to you, and I don't normally read from it. I should, because maybe I will next time, because it has multiple modes, including like regular cinquains, but then it does this stuff on the page too, where the words break up into little letters, and then there's long sections that are just like that. And so each time the language manipulates itself or falls apart in some way, it forces the reader to read it differently. And so in that third poem where the letters break up into that grid, it's like you have to read, like even when I read it at readings, which is why I stopped reading it actually, it's like I stumble over it and I have to pick my way through it. And so when I first read it, that happened. And then I said, I got to practice so I can remember it, or I need to write it out so I know what it says so I don't stumble. And that's what I did the second time I read from it. I did exactly that. And I thought, this isn't the point either. The point is that you're supposed to pick your way through it. So even I should pick my way through it. So then I decided I'm not going to read from it at all for a long time until I forget what it was that I wrote, so that the next time I read, I'll have to kind of do exactly what you would do as a reader to read your way through it. So I just think there's a lot of exciting things that poetry can do. And why would you allow the left margin, the tyranny of the left margin, to just limit your range of expression? It doesn't make any sense. So
No, that was a great freedom.
Yeah.
I really felt like in the Voice of Sheila Chandra, the sense of one of the themes that have been consistent throughout all of your books, Kazim, are, you know, the rejected son, the loss of family, where is home? And in this book, there's this incredibly beautiful embracing of the cosmos and of the universe and things like water and gravity and the celestial spheres, and a letting go of all of that. Well, there are places where the father is mentioned, the sisters. What does it even mean to be Muslim is one of the lines that's in the book. So that those themes are still, you know, there and established, but there's such a sense of letting them go that is gorgeous and freeing, and I don't know, just what are the capabilities of a human being to not be tied to things like family, location, the regional, you know, the things that can drag us down, frankly, and can define us in such narrow sorts of frames that it's a very interesting shift that happens in the book. That's the way I was reading it and just talking about it in my class.
I really appreciate you saying that. I mean, I think that's probably, I mean, I accept it all, you know, I'm not sure where all that's going to lead me. Like, I don't know where I am now. I grew up I grew up around the world, but from about 10 years old onwards, I lived in the Northeast in this little region of space. And, you know, 2 years ago, I came out to California, and, you know, crossing those mountains and coming into the side of the country, I mean, it feels like another country. I live in Southern California now, which is really, you know, Kumeyaay space, historic Mexico, very trans-Pacific Asian space. Like, it's, you know, it's very different. I'm surrounded by culture and language and botany and climate and the sun. So I don't know where all of that is leading me. I have been writing since I've arrived here, and it's, you know, it's a very different work. I just had that moment that you talked about where I turned the page, where I felt like, okay, I've finished this book, meaning the book that not this one that's been published, but there's another, the other one that is now finished, and I don't exactly know what's going to happen next. And I've written a couple of poems since then, like 3 or 4, but I'm in that new state where I don't know what's next, and it's this weird pandemic moment where we're all, like, you know, locked up in our houses, and you know, yeah. So it's the beginning. It's the beginning of things. So, yeah. Well, thanks for being with me, you guys. I feel really great about doing this with you. I feel really, you know, very...
Yeah, it's my bedtime. It's 11:20 here.
Well,
so.
Let me just say to everybody who's still with us, most everybody's still with us, nobody quit yet. Before you leave, please, I'm doing several different events continuing onward to help me promote this book. And so you can look at my calendar at kazimali.com/calendar.html. That's the URL for my calendar that has all the readings. There's a lot coming up, a lot of exciting stuff coming up. I'm going to be reading with Taylor Johnson and Sam Sachs and Jenny Johnson, and a bunch of really cool people. And then in November, Rajiv Mohabir and I are going to be doing an event with the Asian American Writers Workshop, and Sheila Chandra is going to be there, virtually, of course. She's going to Zoom in, as will we all. So I hope you'll just check out the calendar and stay in touch. And you can find me on Twitter at Kazim Ali Poet.
Thank you, Green Apple Books.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, thank you,
everyone,
Mark,
for tuning in, and thank you again, Brian, Gillian, and Kazim. It was amazing hearing you all read, so I really appreciate you guys doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I'm gonna promote this. Please support Green Apple. We do have this in store and online, and yeah. Please support. It helps, you know, us doing events like this, and it helps support, you know, wonderful authors such as everyone here. So thank you again for everyone. All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
This is total fun. Missed you guys.
I know. I miss you too.
Terrible.
See you soon, I hope, after there's a vaccine. And an election, and maybe a new president.
Please.